styling Identity and Ideology in an Age of Riches and Revolution, Rococo and Neoclassical Art in France and its Caribbean Colonies, 1748 to 1815. The ninth lecture treats the theme Feminine Interventions, New Directions during the Directoire. We have entered what might arguably be called a post-revolutionary period, although some scholars see these as the last 4 years of the Revolution. The form of government in France from 1795 to 99 was the Directoire. It was a new incarnation of the First Republic, in which a 5-member committee governed. It would be overthrown by a coup d'etat orchestrated by Napoleon Bonaparte, who during these years was cultivating a brilliant career as a general, with notable campaigns in Italy and Egypt and the Levant. We'll talk more about Napoleon's exploits at this time later, as much of the art celebrating his victories was made after his rise to power at the end of 1799. However, you may be interested to know that militarily, France was stronger than ever and had victories over Austrian-dominated Belgium and Milan and created sister republics in Holland, Switzerland, and other parts of Italy, including Rome. You should remember that, following his participation in the radical activities of the French Revolution, David was imprisoned in the Luxembourg from August to December of 1794, and then again in another prison from May to August of 1795. It might go without saying that he was disillusioned by the chaos of his time and by the potential disintegration of society. And yet, David emerged artistically refreshed in many ways. He had never stopped painting, and to those months in prison date his self-portrait and the view from his prison cell of the Luxembourg Gardens, his only landscape painting. Immediately after his release, David was back in charge of his large and successful studio, something like an academy unto itself at its height. A generation of his pupils had entered the art world in their own right. These include Girodet, who was among the first to enter his studio in 1780, but who had died in Rome in 1788, much to David's chagrin. Fabre had entered his studio in 1783, and we will look at some of his work in a later lecture. Girodet, who had entered his studio in 1785, spent many of the revolutionary years abroad, having won the Prix de Rome in the Annus Mirabilis 1789. Gérard and Gros, 2 more pupils, never won the prize but visited Italy right around the same time. Ingres was one of the first of the post-revolutionary generation, entering David's studio in 1796 and winning the Prix de Rome in 1801. Meanwhile, the winner of the Prix de Rome in 1796 was Guérin, who came from a rival studio, that of Regnault. We will look at works by Girodet, Gérard, Ingres, and Guérin in this lecture. We can start with Girodet's Sleep of Endymion, which is really a rewind to the height of the Revolution. Girodet created the work, an envoi from Rome, in 1791, and exhibited it to great acclaim in Paris at the Salon of 1793. The dramatic break from the various stylistic approaches of the 18th century, including David's neoclassicism, immediately strikes the viewer. This was intentional on the part of Girodet, who wanted to distinguish himself from his teacher, making their career ambitions quite similar, actually. In a letter to his adopted father, Girodet explained the effect, quote, is purely ideal. Critics at the 1793 Salon described the work as poetic, dreamy, and unreal for its novel use of lighting. These descriptors certainly make us think of Romanticism, an umbrella term that covers many different styles of art but generally favors anti-establishment trends and a broader repertoire of themes, including ones that allow for moody settings or subjects. The androgynous figure of Endymion is, of course, very different from David's typical male heroes, and his full frontal nudity is surprising and certainly provocative. I will focus more on the relationship between the subject matter and formal elements in a later lecture on homoerotic art. The smooth, almost uninterrupted contours of Girodet's figures heighten the typical classical valorization of drawing and precision of line already manifested in David's neoclassicism. John Flaxman, whom Girodet knew at this time, was elaborating these qualities in his pared-down illustrations. Clarity and simplicity, hallmarks of classicism, along with seamliness, harmony, balance, and controlled rhythm, have reached their height in what became a purely linear style, with little to no attention given to light and shadow and a minimalistic portrayal of surface textures. Such works were inspired by Greek pottery, particularly the red figure pottery of the classical era that likewise employed line, but no washes or hatching to suggest lights and darks and thus enhance the illusion of volume. Flaxman used his austerely linear style to illustrate Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. His indebtedness to classical Greek pottery developed through his own creation of elegant Wedgwood pottery designs early in his career. Perhaps ironically, he was a sculptor, and while he created many works fully in the round, his numerous bas-relief sculptures share the linear emphasis of his illustrations and likewise emulate classical Greek relief sculpture. Meanwhile, his higher relief funerary monuments would look right at home among the grave steles of 5th and 4th century BC Athens. By the 1780s, both historian collectors like Serroux d'Agincourt and artists like Canova and Flaxman discovered the appeal of Italian painters of the early Renaissance. Flaxman's style has sometimes been called primitive due to its overall simplicity and purity of line, which caused some to see affinities with the so-called Italian primitives of the 1400s, as well as with the ancient Greeks. David could not help but feel the influence of such trends, and we should turn back to him now. As noted, David emerged from prison artistically refreshed. He immediately began sketches for two monumental history paintings, which would serve as pendants to each other. These were the Sabine Women and Leonidas at Thermopylae. The first was produced over 5 years, from 1794 to 99, and the latter was produced over 15 laborious years, from 1799 to 1814. Together, these highly innovative and compositionally daring works encapsulate David's new ideas about art and can be considered examples of a Greek neoclassical manifesto, a sharp break with his neoclassical approach of the 1780s, and an attempt to create a purified Greek version of neoclassicism. Keep in mind that the term neoclassicism was still not widely used to describe his style of the 1780s, and moreover, the idea of a purely Greek style is a bit problematic, as we will certainly discuss. But I want to add to the problems that were apparent even in David's own day, a note that the archaeological and art historical understanding of Greek art wasn't nearly as advanced as it would become during the 20th century, following major excavational work on the Acropolis and in Greece in general, as well as more art historical scholarship. These particular paintings were also conceived of as works to be meditated upon at length, not just aesthetically, but also morally. Coming out of the revolutionary era, David expressed the concern that art was degenerating into a superficial, static, and lifeless imitation of the antique. He strove for a type of Renaissance that emulated, but did not copy, pure antique models in order to revitalize the arts. The Sabine Women, which measured a full 17 feet wide, was presented in a completely novel way. We know David was a rebel when it came to the art establishment and traditional institutions in general, and so it may not surprise you to learn that, in a daring move, he exhibited the monumental canvas not at the Salon, but in his studio, and charged the public to see it. This enabled him to push his creation towards a kind of unique installation art piece, as we shall see. For the moment, I want to mention that David included a pamphlet with the exhibition price. In it, he expounded and defended some of his bold and groundbreaking stylistic choices, as well as explaining the historical narrative underpinning this work. And we might start there. Of course, while it's certainly important to know what we are looking at specifically, it's worth noting that, in keeping with David's talent for conveying dramatic moments through incisive visual formulations, parts of the story speak for themselves. So, you probably remember Brutus in the early days of the Roman Republic. A century earlier, the Horatii and the Curiatii were at war. This work goes back even further, to the very beginning really, right after Romulus's foundation of the city that bears his name. The backstory to this painting is that the Romans have abducted the virtuous maiden daughters of their neighbors, the Sabines. Since abduction was just one of many forms of mating in the ancient world, the Sabine women became Roman wives and bore children. Notably, Hersilia, the daughter of the Sabine king Tatius, had married and had 2 children with Romulus, the Roman king. Then, the Sabine men, now having gathered their forces, invaded Rome to avenge this abduction. Represented on the left is King Tatius, and on the right is Romulus. They are surrounded by warriors from their respective cities. Most importantly, at the center, Hersilia strides in between her father and her husband. She leads the women who have come with their young children in hand to make an emotional plea to the men they love to desist fighting. Accordingly, this work is also called the intervention of the Sabine women. Not only did David display his usual knack for elaborating a pregnant moment, but he also depicted a scene loosely of his own invention that stems from a larger narrative with a more common iconographic representation. There are plenty of artistic examples of the abduction of the Sabine women since the Renaissance, including 2 famous versions by Poussin, one of which is at the Met, a version by Pietro da Cortona, and a statue by Giambologna. By this point, the poignancy of this theme of an attempted reconciliation may have already struck you. David himself certainly felt an interior need for some kind of resolution after so many years of political turmoil that he also deeply personalized at emotional and practical levels in both his art production and in his socio-political participation in the new regime and the new society at large. He had gained many enemies, and while many of them would never forgive him, he felt the need for reconciliation in his personal life and a need for healing in a society where émigrés were returning to France and factions as extreme as monarchists and Republican radicals had to learn to live together again. David's wife Charlotte divorced him as the revolution reached its height in 1794. Her father was a royalist, and the fact that David voted for the king's death in January of 1793 set off a series of quarrels for which no compromise could be found. Oddly, after the fall of Robespierre and David's arrest in the summer of 1794, Charlotte took their children to visit him in prison. She also made efforts to secure his release. The couple remarried in November of 1796 and remained married until death. The art world was gaining increasing consciousness of Greek art, especially as opposed to the more generic Greco-Roman art that fits under the broad umbrella of classicism. Greek art, being the original source, was considered purer, and the new crop of young pupils in David's studios were alternatively pushing these ideas on him and absorbing them from him. Eventually, David determined to, quote, go back to the source and return art to the principles followed by the Greeks. More than one scholar has observed that it might seem strange that David chose a Roman subject for his aesthetic manifesto, although we might remember that the Leonidas, which was conceived at the same time, was a famous event from classical Greek history. Then again, this is not so much Roman history as mythology, and by the time Rome formed its empire, swallowing up Greece while absorbing its culture, it attributed Romulus's lineage to the Trojan prince Aeneas, himself the son of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. And of course, the 8th century BC foundation of ancient Rome predates the classical era in Athens by several centuries. One of the obvious ways David Grecified his painting was by stripping his male figures of their armor, in emulation of the Greek convention of heroic male nudity. This was a controversial and provocative choice, which he felt the need to justify in the aforementioned pamphlet. I will say more about this in my later lecture on the male nude. We might now turn to the woman in white with outstretched arms, a nearly life-size figure at the center of this monumental painting. Her cilia is not the typical woman. While risking her life and that of her children, she is poised, calm, and self-contained. Like Romulus and Tatius, she is an example of moral virtue and fortitude, a grande femme. But she is a woman, and her womanhood is stressed as well. Her breasts are covered but spotlighted under their gauzy cover. Their upright firmness evokes the allegorical revolutionary imagery centered around the nourishing, bountiful, giving femininity of the Republican nation. Next to her cilia, the kneeling woman's full, pendulous breasts bursting forth at the forefront should recall Rousseau's exhortation for mothers to breastfeed, and these women stand among many mothers who carry their children to their conciliatory intervention. David noted in his pamphlet that the Sabine women were compelled to action by their familial responsibilities and their maternal and conjugal love. To quote Dorothy Johnson, a central theme of the painting, therefore, is the significance of women's primordial and essential role in the creation of civilization. It's like a sequel to the Horatii, in which the Sabine women do what Sabina and Camilla couldn't do alone. They use the particular arms they have to supersede the literal power of the men's weapons and change the course of history. Transforming from passive to active, their feminine forms no longer wilt and bend and fall back. They charge to the front, they rush onto the scene, they disturb. Arguably, the men have a morally subordinate position even to the Horaties Camilla and Sabina, for they lack a moral argument, and their inability to resolve their conflict without the mitigation of the women sterilizes them, converting them into decorative stand-ins for the traditional male hero. And this is something that directs art onto the path of the romantic anti-hero. To quote Nanteuil, David strove simultaneously for truth and grandeur. His figures are at the same time human beings and heroes. He borrowed his attitudes from classical bas-reliefs and his figures from contemporary models. Some critics found fault with his choice to borrow poses from antique precedents, but besides the fact that artists had been doing this since the Renaissance, David actually struck the right balance between classical allusion and transformation into his own unique creation. His theme of preserving civilization has been captured in a representation of a singular, fateful, historic, mythical moment, to quote Johnson again, rather than in an allegory. While the painting garnered much praise when it was unveiled, posterity's judgments have been divided about the qualities of this monumental work, whose most striking feature is certainly the frozen appearance of the three main figures, themselves still disposed in a frieze-like manner, in front of a tumultuous, crowded scene. Romulus is so immutable in his pose that it almost seems like he never could have hurled that spear. At the same time, he is glorious in his manly beauty. Hercilia's lack of passion is both elevating and a bit dehumanizing, but the petrified quality of the three primary protagonists is an effective storytelling device. The women in the background effectively capture the quality of bursting onto the scene, just as the raised hands and spears of the warriors capture the menacing, hectic energy of war. So Hercilia's abrupt interruption of Tatius and Romulus's combat can be that moment, suspended in time for thought and contemplation. One imagines that time itself froze for these figures, Tatius and Romulus, stunned but focused as they determined what to do next, and Hercilia, as she breathlessly awaited their decision. Yet, even in this breathlessness, she maintains a self-composure that is more commanding than truly supplicatory. It is as immediately quieting as the bidding of a goddess. This moment can only be frozen in time, a calm in the storm whirling around the three protagonists, to be a contemplative one, and everyone who stood in front of this work in 1799 would be contemplating the end of civil war and internal strife in France. All things considered, it is still a painting that privileges classical line rather than painterly mass. It has little of the buzzing, vibrating quality of Delacroix's brushstrokes, and yet the dozen or so prominent figures in the foreground, each one studied so carefully, crafted really so carefully, nonetheless form a cohesive whole. The undulating lines are unifying, as are the volumes and their interstices. The harmonious colors and limited palette are highly unifying as well. The palette used for the drapery is still autumnal, ranging from reds to orange to golden ochres, which harmonize with the skin tones. There are touches of the customary blue or green, but even the most vibrant reds work well against the burnt umber bricks of Rome's walls, which tie those reds to the brown horse at the right. Hercilia's symbolically pure and chromatically singular spotlighted white dress draws necessary attention to the center of the canvas, but also harmonizes well with the silvery tones that unite the colors across the surface. Dark smoke fills the sky, but the lighting returns to the somewhat theatrical quality of the Horatii. There is an effective sense of atmosphere, but it's hard to imagine the conditions of sun and weather in a tangibly realistic way. For these reasons, David's painted work, though spatially accurate in one sense, also has the quality of the type of sculpted relief he was viewing. That's to say, the foreground figures are convincingly volumetric, but the background figures have that flattening quality of very low relief and less detailed background elements found in Greco-Roman sculptural friezes. This relief quality became more pronounced in a bunch of works done in the first years of the 19th century, notably by Ingres, as we shall see shortly. As noted, David set the painting up in his studio and charged an entry fee. He justified doing so by citing the example of antiquity, and also of contemporary England. Practical considerations drove his choice as well. The funding for official patronage for major history works declined after the fall of the monarchy. David's 17-foot canvas had to be specially ordered from Flanders, and was not cheap. Fee notwithstanding, crowds flocked to the latest masterpiece of the illustrious David for 5 years after its opening in December of 1799. David exhibited the monumental work on a wall with a large mirror opposite it so viewers could see themselves in front of these life-size painted figures. The critic Chaussard, who praised the work at great length, noted that this juxtaposition revealed such a precise rendering of human flesh tones that the painted tones were indistinguishable from the reflected viewer's skin. By looking in the mirror, viewers could also judge the painting in a variety of different ways to determine whether David had been truly successful. One critic noted that there was typically a religious silence in front of the awe-inspiring work. The use of this metaphor evokes the new Romantic spirit that only augmented after 1789, even if French artistic productions had not yet fully moved in this direction. Arguably, there are romantic qualities in David's shift to the purified Greek style, but then again, there is also something inherently romantic about the conviction with which David elaborated the impossibly heroic image of the Horatii and its avant-garde stylistic qualities. It may depend on if the question we're asking is whether a work is academic or not, or whether a work has a classical or romantic stylistic approach, or classical or romantic themes. Romanticism embraces so many styles, and not just the painterly ones that essentially define the movement in France, so it's not an easy term to pin down, and under its umbrella, in literature, one finds classic examples of romantic poetry and a Philhellenism, or love of Greece. Think, for example, of Byron's Ode to Greece in the third canto of Don Juan. David's own artistic Philhellenism had pushed him to explore new painterly solutions. The nudity and the unbridled horses add a primitive touch, just as the antique costumes and accessories offer a classicizing exoticism. The placement of the mirror certainly helped transport viewers to a faraway place that felt nothing like turn-of-the-century Paris, which is a romantic idea. The canvas intentionally elicited strong emotion, heightening the type of sentimentalism that emerged in the 18th century but came to be associated with Romanticism. In fact, in this work, reconciliation may be the only moral message, a principle that had been so dear to Enlightenment theorists. Hercilia is a grande femme for making a purely emotional appeal, but the only counter-argument is vengeance or pride. There is no moral message or tragic conflict, only raw bravery on the part of the women. And the viewer doesn't have to make a difficult decision between the virtues of patriotic duty and the personal matters of the heart. Even without knowing the particulars of the story, the painting can, in fact, work in an allegorical manner. It cries out, "Put down your arms and stop fighting." It cries out, "Think of the children." And it's abundantly clear which sex embodies those messages. Furthermore, Chaussard declared that, quote, "To appreciate this painting, that's to say, to feel this painting, it is not necessary to know anything about art." Adios, pretentious art critics and academics. On that note, maybe we can move to an even more radically anti-academic artistic formulation. The primitifs, méditateurs, or Barbus, a group of pupils in David's studio, pushed their teacher's hostility for academic constraints to a certain hostility for David's own work. Their individuality had certainly been encouraged by David, who tended to draw out the particular strengths of his pupils rather than having them conform to a method. But they criticized the Sabine women so harshly and caused so much commotion that he ejected the group from his studio in 1800. The group, whose leader was Maurice Quay, desired to push the archaicizing aesthetic of Greek pottery and the Italian early Renaissance artists to further limits. Vegetarians and Philhellenes, they gravitated towards Greek subject matter, but also expanded their repertoire to include the Old Testament and Ossian, the so-called Homer of the North. The eccentric young rebels were mocked in the streets of Paris for wearing Greek-inspired costumes, and their beards are what earned them the moniker Barbus, or bearded ones. Few of their paintings remain, and Quay died at only 26 years old in 1804. On a side note, the coining of the term Rococo for the then scorned style of Louis XV has been attributed to Quay. Young Ingres, who would become the preeminent classicist of the Romantic era in France, in opposition to Directoire from the 1820s to 1860s, was not a Barbus, but he was influenced by their aesthetic ideas. His winning Prix de Rome painting, The Ambassadors of Agamemnon in the Tent of Achilles in 1801, emphasized the linear abstraction that was popular at this time, and it anticipates the manneristic sinuosity of his later works. Visiting the salon, Flaxman greatly admired this work and criticized David's approach as already outdated. Like many of the paintings in this lecture, I will return to this one in a later thematic discussion of the male nude. Ingres' Venus injured by Diomedes of 1803 perhaps even more clearly shows the relief style. It's as if the painted forms are not even intended to represent real-life volumes, but rather only the raised surface of bas-relief sculpture. In fact, it almost looks more like a painted relief panel than like a painting on canvas. In this subject from Homer's Iliad, Ingres once again reveals his penchant for an arabesque linear style. During his years in Rome, Ingres' style remained linear, but some works showed a more marked lack of depth than others. As late as 1811, Thetis Beseeching Jupiter, a mandatory 10-foot-high history painting completed for the final year of his scholarship, met with strong criticism when it was sent back to the Paris Salon. Ingres, whose subject was once again taken from Homer's Iliad, had written that he intended for the work to, quote, smell of ambrosia from a mile away, meaning that it would appear authentically Greek. You'll notice that the particular way the contours are shadowed, again, doesn't so much flatten the work completely as cause the figures to appear as if they have the shallow raised volume of bas-relief on a flat, almost uniformly blue background, almost like a more fully colored extension of the golden, low-relief scenes at the base of Zeus's throne. Critics noticed this and disapproved of the lack of depth. They also found fault with Ingres' drawing. A true classicist who always gave primacy to line and design over color throughout his career, Ingres nonetheless never actually gratified the academic primacy of anatomically correct drawing, and his lines often fall into a kind of elegant abstraction. Accordingly, the broad shoulders and small, undistinguished head of the father of the gods found harsh detractors. In the 1920s, Thetis's curiously swollen neck was explained by invoking a thyroid condition. This was hardly Ingres' intention, but his implausible drawing flouts all concessions to underlying bone and muscle, never mind proportion. The work seems to derive from an amalgam of sources, with Flaxman's Homeric illustrations providing the primary inspiration for Thetis, and possibly for Jupiter as well. We should also note an engraving of Jupiter from Cayles's Recueil des Antiquités, or possibly Van Eyck's 15th century God the Father. This subject may be considered a kind of cousin to the Sabine Women, for it shows a female figure beseeching a male in time of war. However, Thetis pleads that Jupiter, or Zeus as we might properly call him with regard to the Greek epic, honor her son Achilles, that he avenge the disrespect Achilles' allied Achaeans have shown him by punishing the Achaeans and thus essentially reversing the recent streak of victories, and with it, the power dynamics of the Trojan War at large. In some ways, it works as a kind of visual foil to the female empowerment of the Sabines, but like them, Thetis prevails. Moreover, the impassive Zeus is as frozen in time as Romulus, whereas the animated linear energy buzzes through Thetis's drapery and swells up in her sweeping, reaching gestures. Ingres illustrates well the Homeric description of a conventional supplication. The beseeching figures, either male or female, lower themselves to embrace the knees of the figure they beseech, thus symbolizing humility or desperation. Thetis is bolder than some of her male counterparts performing similar rituals in Homer's epics. When Zeus hesitates, she persistently clings to the deity's knees. At the same time, she grasps him underneath the chin, another supplicatory gesture, though more associated with gentle, seductive pleading. Romulus, conqueror at Akron, made around the same time, probably exemplifies Ingres' output at the height of his relief style. We should return to the years of the Directoire and the early consulate at the heart of this lecture, but first I want to consider in more depth this idea of a return to Greek purity, manifested in individualized but closely related ways by David, Ingres, Flaxman, and the Barbus, and others, that occurred at a time when only the surface of archaeology had been scratched. We know that the Italians of the Renaissance were the first to systematically revalorize and emulate antiquity in all forms. We know that they sparked the philological study of ancient Greek texts and brought the language back into the humanist curriculum. We know that 3 centuries later, Winckelmann was the beneficiary of such scholarship and that he can be counted among the first Hellenophiles, or Philhellenes. I should add here that the Greeks' own word for Greek is Hellene, and that the word phile is often used to connote a love for something, like bibliophile, francophile, etc. I have mentioned that the Greek-populated territories controlled by the Ottoman Empire were not, however, easily accessible. At the outset of our period of study, in 1748, James Stewart and Nicholas Rivet, British Grand Tour guides in Rome, made a plan to travel to Athens to make accurate drawings of any ancient remains they might find there. They took their first step in the city of Pericles, of Sophocles, of Socrates, and of Aristophanes in 1751, and produced influential volumes on Athenian and Greek antiquities by the later 18th and early 19th centuries. Interest in all things Greek grew. William Cowper made a new primitivist translation of the Iliad in 1791. Such enthusiasm reflects the Philhellenism that was part of the later phase of Neoclassicism. This sentiment, incidentally, would directly spur Europeans to join in the fight for Greek independence against the Ottomans in the 1820s. In the meantime, more antiquarians trickled in. From 1801 to 1812, agents of Lord Elgin removed about half of the surviving sculptures of the Parthenon, as well as sculptures from the Propylaea and the Erechtheion, and had them shipped to Britain. The removal and overseas voyage, with the technology of the early 19th century, obviously caused some damage to these invaluable works, although arguments have been made that the move largely saved them. Whether the British were good custodians or opportunists, the Greeks have formally requested the repatriation of their historical heritage, but the British have proven unyielding, and the debate goes on. In any case, these sculptures were seen by a broad Western European public for the first time in London in 1807. The authentic masterpieces of high classical art from 5th century BC Athens looked dissimilar to the works the words of Winckelmann had conjured up. They looked unrelated to the almost exclusively later Roman copies of original Greek bronze and marble statues. This prompted mixed reactions. Early Romantics like Fuseli, Benjamin West, the essayist painter William Hazlitt, and later the poet Keats were enthralled. On the other hand, Richard Payne Knight, the antiquarian specialist in phallic imagery, went so far as to say that the sculptures were not from the epic of Phidias, but rather from the epic of Hadrian, some 550 years later. As I noted earlier, most original Greek sculpture was either unseen or unexcavated when David returned to Greek purity in the 1790s. The neoclassicist would have been horrified by the knowledge that the gleaming white marble of building and statue was covered by paint. All Greco-Roman sculpture was painted, a surface coating that has effaced with the centuries. Even parts of buildings beyond the representational pediment sculptures and frieze reliefs were painted. As for statues in bronze, the color of the metal approximated skin tones, and inlays for pertinent parts of the body with other colors were habitually added. The ancient Greek vase paintings so admired by Flaxman and others, though stunning, never aspired to recreate the panel painting of the same period, and virtually no paintings from that era have survived. Some of the best copies and reworkings of Greek paintings would be found at Pompeii in the forms of mosaics or murals, and some surviving works from the Hellenistic period have been unearthed as well. Though some pictorial developments of vase painting and panel painting overlap, there is one element that vase painting rarely or never attempted, and that's the type of modeling with light and shadow that adds volume to a 2D work that we've been talking about. Surviving texts tell us that Zeuxis, a painter of the high classical period whose name we mentioned in conjunction with the painting of Helen, successfully created the illusion of mass and volume through light and shadow in his panel paintings. A Neo-Greek movement, another subdivision of classicism in the second half of the 19th century, would strive once again to approximate these purely Greek ideals. But I think we can let it suffice to say that the artists of the last decade of the 18th and first decade of the 19th century were indeed pretty well acquainted with some of the pictorial conventions and stylistic traits of ancient Greek art, but at the same time that they lacked a deeply meaningful understanding of what it was to recreate a Greek-style work. David's putatively purely Greek Sabine Women, though meeting with some serious complaints, was generally celebrated by both critics and the public. Though unflattering in their way, various caricatures attest to the iconic status of David's work. One of these, Koch's caricature of the Stuttgart Academy, visualized the conflict between academic establishment precepts, which would turn artists into competent professionals, and the anti-academic rebellion of students, who maintained that art was a vocation driven by the desire for personal expression and with the possibility of personal aspirations. One of the ways the Stuttgart Academy stripped art students of their individualism was to require them to wear civil service uniforms. The drawing shows the intervention of an artist in a dispute between the director of the academy and the liberal students. A later caricature, a lithograph, depicts a group of heroic students revolting against David himself, due to the cost of his tuition. David is depicted as a reactionary fop with a pre-revolutionary style wig, a highly unexpected satirical representation of him. By contrast, the rebels are well-muscled and tough. Note the central painter who has taken Romulus's pose. Another figure, presumably the model, is bare-chested. Even antique statuary seems to have turned on David, with nude figures in the background striking statuesque poses, notably that of the Apollo Belvedere. One trend after the revolution was to steer away from overcharged moral or ideological messages from antiquity. The eroticism that had seeded in the late Rococo period to serious neoclassicism for a decade re-emerged in the late 1790s, following the example of Vien to some degree and Girodet's Endymion. Gérard's Cupid and Psyche, measuring 6 feet in height, was a sensation at the Salon of 1798. In the original story, in which Cupid was sent by his mother to prick Psyche with his arrow and cause her to fall in love with another man, but instead falls in love with the beautiful girl himself, Cupid only comes to Psyche at night, so she can't see him. Although she is falling in love with him, she is curious about who he is, and so the more oft-represented moment from the story is when she brings in a lamp to observe him while he is sleeping. Gérard has placed them in full daylight, in a lushly verdant Arcadian landscape, but with otherwise very few details of place or setting. The open hillside with the distant mountain background, however, is nothing like the approach of the Rococo artists, where luxuriant foliage often frames a circular or oval opening onto a blue sky, into which the receding clusters of leaves dissolve seamlessly into the puffy clouds. Gérard has created a wonderful sense of atmosphere, with a mix of cloud types tending towards gray on the right and a haziness on the left that softens the sun. Even so, bright highlights help define the sculpturesque forms. The emphasis on silhouette or outline with Cupid in profile view, combined with an approach to rendering flesh that turns it into a marble smoothness, fits into the new relief quality of painting. And despite the sprawling depth of the background, it can also be read as a flat backdrop to these low-relief figures in the front. In any case, because Gérard has placed them outdoors, the erudite viewer must infer from Psyche's blank gaze that Cupid is invisible to her as he delivers his first kiss. Psyche's symbol, the symbol of the soul, the butterfly, already floats above her. Despite some rough patches, the story will end happily and she will gain her wings, a counterpart to Cupid's. In their crystalline perfection, the bodies are incredibly still and immutable, outside of time, as Thomas Crow points out. The frozen stillness, the hazy background, and the smooth corporeal perfection can all be found, though to a less stark degree, in the painting of the Sabine women that David was drawing closer to completing by this time. Canova was an Italian artist who was influenced in his neoclassicism by the international community of artists working in Rome. He also eventually worked for French patrons. His Cupid and Psyche in marble anticipated Gérard's work in painting. As Hugh Honor notes, it perfectly unites form and idea and was conceived on more than one level of meaning. The first was typical of the purely formal perfection sought by neoclassicists, here in a complex three-dimensional composition whose interlocking forms and contrapuntal harmony revolve through a series of mellifluous and apparently effortless transitions. At another level, the marble sculpture operates as an idyllic representation of a young love, of slim adolescence and limbs as tender as eyelids, with all its dewy innocence and purity. Finally, and still following from Honor, the work operates on a deeper, more symbolic level as a love-death image of that moment of perfect reciprocity and the transport of physical passion when a state of almost mystical union is experienced at the still point of the turning world. Overall, Canova has stretched the limits of naturalism in his idealism. It was never his intention, though, to give a lifelike appearance to his perfect bodily forms and formally perfect compositions. Regnault was a painter of David's generation with a competing studio. His type of neoclassicism often retains something of the Baroque, although it has certainly been purified by David's example. His Three Graces of 1799 owes less to archaeological precedents than Raphael's depiction of the subject in the early 1500s, but the stark black background certainly emphasizes contours. The type of full frontal nudity for females seen here was just as rare as for males. However, when employed, it typically had its own set of conventions. These conventions followed from antique examples and largely involved taking what I've called the Barbie doll crotch approach. That's to say, the vulva is not articulated. There is no hint of the pudendal cleft, never mind the labia, beyond the hairless mons pubis. This approach remains standard in all types of painting, most prominently classically styled painting throughout the 19th century. Guérin was Regnault's pupil, one of the rare artists to come to prominence at this time who had not passed through David's studio. He was one of 3 winners of the Prix de Rome in 1797 when the competition was reinstituted. Unfortunately, he was unable to travel to Italy, but just 2 years later he exhibited his first major history piece, almost 9 feet on the long side, at the Salon. The return of Marcus Sextus dates to the time of civil war in the ancient Roman Republic, in the early years of the 1st century BC. About 32 years before Julius Caesar, Sulla was declared dictator of Rome. Taking absolute control, he instituted a series of so-called proscriptions, a program that enabled him to execute those whom he perceived as enemies of the state and confiscate their property. Among those proscribed was Marcus Sextus, an ahistorical figure imagined by Guérin. However, Sulla later withdrew his power and re-established the pre-existing consular leadership of Rome, At that time, Sextus Marcus returned to find his wife dead and his family shattered. The subject, more than just the painting itself, made the work a popular success at the Salon of 1799. Crowds surrounded it, visitors left poems in its frame, and art students covered it with laurel garlands. Of course, in post-revolutionary France, the parallels to the situation of the émigrés who had fled France and who were now returning under the more conciliatory regimes of the Directoire and the Consulate were manifest. Guérin imagined this fictional character in order to avoid attaching any deeper layers of meaning to the work that might come with the choice of a well-known historical figure. Instead, the picture offers a sentimental critique of political persecution and grievous civil war, and thus remains a blank slate on which viewers could project their own stories and situations. Guérin's stylistic approach is typical of Davidian neoclassicism. In fact, David was heard to say that Guérin had been listening outside my door. However, the style had become pretty generalized by that time. Certainly, Guérin offered a perfect representation of a man who is stoic in face of the loss of his wife, while his daughter gives full rein to her emotions. On the other hand, David's typical grid-like underpinning here rises boldly to the surface in a prominent central Greek cross arrangement. The sense of atmosphere has changed as well. The suffused light and shadowed countenance of Marcus Sextus recall David's Brutus, but the more pervasive darkness with its lunar highlights indicates an awareness of the new proto-romantic sensibility of Girodet's Endymion. This lecture concludes here. While moving forward into the 19th century in subsequent lectures, we will also be looking back at this period to elaborate certain themes, such as the Haitian Revolution, portraiture and fashion, homoeroticism, and the iconography of Napoleon.